Hello, my name is Dylan. I'm a historian and resident of Santa Ana, California, and this is a history video that I've struggled with for a very, very long time. In May of 2022, the city of Santa Ana passed a resolution to performatively apologize for the municipal burning of its Chinatown on 25 May 1906. Except the motivation behind that resolution is a lie, complete and total anti truth. This short documentary, I hope, will properly illustrate the event and present the facts as they happened, allowing you to come to your own conclusions. Stephen Gould's 1995 book, The Burning of Santa Ana's Chinatown and the Murder of Makla Fat, provided the initial interest for this project. It is filled with primary sources and decades of documentation and what I would think to be a thorough bibliography for the pre-internet era. Young historians like me stand on the shoulders of historians like the late Stephen Gould. Just as well, I also consulted with Samuel Armour's History of Orange County, published in 1921. This is a toe cruncher, and several more books, newspaper accounts, and new research that simply wasn't available before the internet. The Huntington Library was also very helpful in ferreting out some new details. I will do my best to tell the most complete version of the truth without omission or equivocation because that's what events like this deserve. It's what the public deserves. And I ask that you do your best to not place today's lens on yesterday's history. We have the privilege of hindsight being 2020 and access to information that simply wasn't available in 1906. And what do we have from the time because the artifacts tell the tale? This is an 1880s ledger book from the First National Bank of Santa Ana. On one of its pages, it lists all of the Chinese depositors and amounts, and their names are written in their native written language as well as spelled out phonetically. But given the language barrier, this is still an approximation. Secondly, I was recently gifted this small souvenir plate. It depicts a scene looking down Santa Ana's 4th Street in downtown, looking west. This street scene dates to the very early 1900s. And on the back, we see the name of the dealer, George Edgar. More on him later. Now, before we get into it, I wanted to offer some background. Santa Ana was founded in 1869 by William Henry Spurgeon. It was the second city in what would become Orange County, which seceded from Los Angeles County in 1889. The first settlement in the post-Rancho period was the colony of Anaheim, founded in 1857 by the Los Angeles Vineyard Society, German immigrants who planned to cultivate wine grapes in the fertile bottomlands of the Santa Ana Valley. Between 1857 and 1884, Anaheim and Central Orange County was the leading wine producer in the western United States, producing 1 million gallons annually at its peak. This was before Napa and Sonoma were even a thing. Anaheim wine could be found across the globe. Sadly, Pierce's disease began to blight the crop in 1884. By 1888, 120,000 acres of Orange County wine legacy died on the vine. But who do you think picked those grapes? A party of Anaheim pioneers answered that question when they left for San Francisco in the early 1860s, during the waning days of the California Gold Rush, to bring back the first of several groups of Chinese laborers. By 1876, there were 125 Chinese people living in Anaheim. That's about 1/6 of Anaheim's total population at that time. But this would change cyclically with the harvest season. Santa Ana's population, just to the south, had an estimated 800 Chinese residents during its peak in the 1880s. In the census year of 1880, there were 3,240 people living in Santa Ana Township, as opposed to the 350,000-ish today. In the 1890s, the Earl Fruit Company imported Chinese labor from Los Angeles to construct canals and reclaim swampland in order to cultivate celery. Thanks to these men, land that was worth $10 per acre suddenly was worth $300. Looking at you, Fountain Valley. Further, the Chinese are actually credited in Armour's book with revolutionizing how oranges were packed and shipped, recognizing that crates could be packed more efficiently if the oranges were of the same size and wrapped in paper. This soon became common practice and was industrialized. Importantly, these Chinese men should be credited with the construction of several railroad projects in and around Orange County, such as the rail line from Newport Wharf and Lumber Company, owned and operated by the McFadden brothers. Their labor connected Santa Ana to the Pacific coast for the first time. Santa Ana's Chinatown was located on the northeastern corner of the block of 3rd and Bush Streets in downtown Santa Ana. For the locals, this site is the parking lot directly behind the Art Deco City Hall on Main and 3rd, and directly south and across the street from La Casa Blanca Beauty Salon. If you know, you know. These Sanborn fire insurance maps, made available through the Library of Congress, are an incredible resource. These detailed maps illustrate the growth and changes in Santa Ana and its Chinatown beginning in 1884. Chinatown in 1906 was home to about 200 men. No women or children are reported to have lived there. This was typical of the immigrant lifestyle, men making a living and sending money back home to support their families. There were also Chinese quarters hidden on West 4th Street. I say hidden because it was located in the alleys behind the Brunswick and Semi-Tropic hotels. Adolph Butts, who owned a plumbing shop across the street where La Casa Blanca is today, described Chinatown as occupied by numerous laundrymen, vegetable growers, and peddlers. It may have been around 200. They dragged in all kinds of trash, not having adequate sewer facilities, and the location became a menace to health. It also had a bad effect on nearby property. Martha Marie Schaefer was a wealthy widow who inherited the land and buildings that made up Chinatown after her late husband Uriah Lewis Schaefer died in Orange in 1902. Together, they were original Orange County pioneers, arriving in the late 1870s and owned several hundred acres of agricultural land as well as prime lots in Santa Ana's downtown. Mrs. Schaefer lived on North Main Street near the intersection of Chapman and what was then called West Orange. She was active in the spiritualist church and purportedly took part in seances and was consistently out of town. As I discovered, Mrs. Schaefer was born in 1844 and was 62 years old in 1906. And from what I can glean from the research, she was the Dowager Countess of Orange County, or at least one of them, seemingly well educated, business savvy, unabashedly litigious, and eccentric when it suited her. The life ways of the Chinese men who rented from the widow Schaefer were varied. Day laborers, servants, handymen, peddlers, cooks, door-to-door vegetable salesmen, and the ubiquitous Chinese laundry of the American West. These celestials, as they were called, as opposed to other much more derogatory things, occupied the lowest rung in the societal structure in some aspects. In others, they occupied much higher climes. In either case, segregation and xenophobia, which is the fear of foreigners, were the egg drop soup of the day. The Chinese community lived well outside of the bounds of the European cultural sphere, figuratively, of course. Physically, they lived right in the middle of the city. A 12-year-old Charles Swanner was a witness to the burning and remembered this in his memoir. The dogs, cats, and rats running around both in and out of the buildings, as well as the sights and smells of the premises, was objectionable to the entire community. He further described Chinatown as a series of junky redwood shacks enlivened with red paper, varnished ducks, rattan baskets, calico partitions, and odd smells which some interpreted as the brooding spiritual atmosphere of the Orient, whatever that means. It is important to note that Charles Swanner wrote these remembrances as an older man in his 50s and 60s. From the beginning, Santaneros voiced objection, and the Board of Trustees received complaints calling to eradicate this plague spot, this eyesore of the city, akin to how some of the neighbors complain about the unhoused population in Santa Ana today. Who remembers the encampment in the Plaza of the Flags between Santa Ana City Hall and Santa Ana Public Library? Wasn't that also called a public health crisis? The Board of Trustees ignored these complaints until the problem was directly on their doorstep. In 1903, the city purchased a lot for their new city hall for the low price of $850, almost $30,000 today. Why so cheap? It was next door to Chinatown. The City Board of Trustees moved into their new, shiny $20,000 City Hall in November of 1904. In today's money, that building would cost just over $430,000. Quite literally, the back windows of the City Hall opened up onto the open yard of Chinatown, with all of its sights, sounds, and smells. The city got what it paid for. The remainder of 1904 and all of 1905 and into the spring of 1906 passed without incident. Chinatown was raided at regular intervals by Santa Ana police. The police were looking for evidence of illegal gambling, but nothing ever reportedly came from these raids. I would compare this to the harassment of street food vendors in Santa Ana by police and code enforcement today. On 23 May 1906, the city trustee president George A. Edgar, remember the plate guy, and Dr. John Ingram Clark, the city health officer, entered Chinatown to inspect the premises. During this inspection, they walked into a small dark room with fresh fruit and vegetables littering the space, some in baskets, some in piles on the floor. In the corner, on a makeshift bed, was an elderly Chinese man, his body reportedly riddled with what was described as the sores of leprosy. Now, before we get in too deep, let's talk about leprosy, and I urge everyone to do their own research to their own satisfaction. And please, feel free to skip ahead as some of these depictions are a bit unsettling. So, what is leprosy? Leprosy, or Hansen's disease, as it is also called, is a bacterial infection that can damage the nerves, respiratory tract, skin, and eyes. This nerve damage may result in a lack of ability to feel pain, contributing to the losing of parts of one's extremities from repeated injuries or infection through unnoticed wounds. Leprosy symptoms may begin within 1 year, but for some people, symptoms may take 20 years or more to appear. Leprosy has a low pathogenicity, and 95% of people contracting leprosy do not develop the disease. Spread is believed to occur through cough or contact with a fluid from mucous membranes in the nose of a person infected by leprosy. Genetic factors and immune function affect how easily a person catches the disease. Sounds familiar. Leprosy does not spread during pregnancy or through sexual contact. Leprosy occurs more commonly among people living in poverty. In very rare cases, it can be spread from mammal to human, usually through the eating of an infected animal, such as the red armadillo. But again, these cases are very, very rare. Leprosy is also heavily burdened with social stigma because it causes lesions, facial disfigurements, and deformities. And more specifically, in Chinese culture, where it is considered a punishment for immoral acts, its resulting facial disfigurement and mutilation of limbs is feared. The unfortunate people to contract the disease became lepers and were exiled from their homes. The disparaging of calling someone a leper is directly derived from leprosy. In China today, leprosy is strongly associated with poverty, and stigma remains a significant barrier to effective treatment. In 1906, the treatment options for leprosy were quite limited compared to the advancements made in recent decades. The primary approach to managing leprosy in 1906 involved isolating individuals with the disease in specialized institutions called leprosaria or leprosy asylums. The Los Angeles Herald published this column in response to the Santa Ana case, quoting in part Dr. C.P. Barber of Los Angeles County Hospital.
There is only one way to handle a case of leprosy, and that is to isolate it. There is no cure yet discovered for the disease, and although I have gone so far as to study the most eminent authorities among the Oriental countries, there is not even a system of relief. The Santa Ana people have suggested that a trained nurse be hired to attend the leper, but that would be impossible. A physician of St. Louis was the only man who ever attempted to tend a leper, and he escaped without contracting the disease, and he obtained some valuable information regarding the disease, but the leper did not benefit from it. I had the first case of leprosy several years ago when I first went to the county hospital. There were 3 men there then, and they were being tended in a poor sort of a place on one side of the grounds. We built a nice little cottage for them and divided the rooms off nicely. Then we built a high stockade about this cottage and left enough room for the inmates to have a garden. One was an Austrian sailor who had become infected in the West India Islands. Another was a Chinese who had contracted the dread disease in the north. And another was a Spaniard. All had the symptoms to a more or less marked degree. Leprosy is a skin disease, and the germ is one of darkness, and closely resembles a tuberculosis germ. The first symptom we look for is a thickening of the skin on the forehead, ears, and chin. The skin, often without wrinkling, will become like leather and be very thick. Then spots appear on the body, and while the spots are sensitive, at a distance you could stick a pin in the flesh and the patient would not know it. The third symptom is the shooting pains, which cause misery in the earlier stages of the disease, but which later disappear. and then the body slowly decays. First, the skin becomes purely white, and the fingers gradually drop off a joint at a time. The next appearance of the disease is at the edges of the nostrils and mouth, and then, later, the internal organs are attacked and the patient dies. There is only one way to handle a case, and that is to isolate and put a guard to watch. Send the food in and never take anything out, and the patient, until the disease attacks the heart and dies instantly, is able to attend himself. No nurses required. Isolation is the only way to handle the Santa Ana case.
While there was no definitive cure for leprosy at the time, the treatment of patients in leprosy asylums focused on providing a supportive and sanitary environment and attempted to alleviate the symptoms and slow down the progression of the disease. A viable treatment was not found until 1943. Today, it is considered very treatable. I urge everyone to read into the Kalaupapa leprosy settlement on the island of Molokai in Hawaii and the National Leprosarium at Carville, Louisiana, which was created by an act of Congress in 1917. Also, local UCI grad and I believe educator Adria Imada recently published a book, An Archive of Skin, An Archive of Kin, about the intersections of leprosy and public health at the turn of the 20th century in Hawaii. So, here is a disease that medicine didn't really understand but was trying. A disease that causes deformities and disfigurements that can carry a deep social stigma. Very much like the social stigma that persisted during the COVID-19 pandemic and in some cases persists to this day. Leprosy has affected humanity since the beginning of recorded history, and it is mentioned several times throughout the Bible. This was the disease of the Bible, and it was here in Santa Ana, the church city, where the ideas surrounding the government's responsibilities towards public health were in their infancy. They didn't know what they didn't know. So what happened after they found that afflicted man in Chinatown? Well, the Board of Health held an emergency meeting that evening, 24 May, after Dr. Jesse Amberlew made the report to the board. Doctors Gordon and Clark went to investigate Chinatown for themselves and confirm the diagnosis. A special meeting of the Board of Trustees was called for 10 a.m. the following day, 25 May, at 219 North Main Street. The finding of leprosy in Santa Ana was reported by Dr. Clark, and the entire Board of Trustees left chambers to inspect Chinatown. They wouldn't have to walk very far. The Chinese had known about the sick man for some time. Most of the Chinese had left Chinatown once they knew the city had discovered their compatriot. They knew what had happened in San Francisco and Los Angeles. All but 7 men had left Chinatown for other parts of the county. The trustees found the man in his room. He had lived in Santa Ana for nearly 2 decades and was in his mid to late 50s. Doctors questioned him. His name was reportedly Wang Wo-ye. We shall call him Mr. Wang. This seems to be the most consistent name for the man, even though he was given several in the press. In Chinese culture, as I learned, the first name is the family name, and the second name is actually his given name. Dr. Jesse Amberlew, probably the most respected doctor in the city at that time, became the de facto primary physician for Mr. Wang, and was very heavily involved in his care and how this was represented in the press. It should be noted that Dr. Burlew was well known for his prudence and expertise as a physician and surgeon, but also for his humanity and treating people he knew could not pay him for his services. The trustees returned to chambers and deliberated and argued for hours on how to handle the situation, either by condemning Chinatown and boarding it up, suggested by A.C. Tidy, or burning it, which was favored by most of the others. Trustee John Cubbin was in favor of getting the property appraised by 3 appraisers before any action was taken. The majority of the board favored burning the property because they feared the animals, even the flies, would be infected and somehow fly into the council chambers and infect them all. Boy, what they didn't know. City Attorney Colonel W.F. Heathman had raised the question of possible criminal or civil charges for damages against the trustees. Eyes shifted to the district attorney, Horace Caldwell Head, who assured the board that no complaint or warrants would be filed from the county, as they would have to go through him. It should be noted that Horace Head was the son of a prominent member of the Ku Klux Klan back home in Tennessee. Now, what do they do at Chinatown? Well, Mrs. Schaefer was away at her home in Hermosa Beach, and her attorney, Mr. Clyde Bishop, acted as her proxy. Clyde Bishop voiced his concerns to the board against the destruction of his client's private property and asserted that the only body to authorize the burning would be the Board of Health. The Board of Trustees summarily told Mr. Bishop to mind his own business. But what would they do with Mr. Wong, who was in a very bad way and near death? The trustees placed the property of Chinatown under quarantine. Mr. Wong was removed to an isolation tent under guard near the corner of Main and 2nd Streets, and he was now the county's problem. The remaining 7 Chinese men who stayed were to be fumigated with what we don't know and placed in quarantine off-site. County Supervisor Hudson Eugene Smith of Santa Ana first suggested reaching out to Los Angeles for assistance and finding a qualified nurse or specialist for the sick man. Ultimately, the Board of Trustees attempted to pass a Resolution 416 condemning Chinatown as a public nuisance and directing the city fire marshal to deliberately set flame to the buildings. A municipal act of arson. The ayes for the initial vote were Trustees Wright, Black, and Edgar. Trustees John Cubbin and A.C. Tidy initially dissented and voted no to Resolution 416 as written. They did not favor burning down Chinatown. Board President Edgar was unsatisfied with this, and after much discussion amended the resolution to include the words under the direction of the Board of Health. Cubbin and Tidy finally cowed to their colleagues after this amendment. Trustee John Cubbin resigned from the Board of Trustees at the following meeting on 28 May in shame for his part. His resignation was accepted by his former colleagues. In Stephen Gould's book, John Cubbin is quoted as saying, "Purge that plague hole once and for all, burn that damn place down, and do it tonight." I cannot find any evidence that he said that. There isn't a footnote for it in the book either. It is possible that there was some editorializing on the part of the late Orange County historian Jim Sleeper or by Mr. Gould himself. But in the face of the evidence of Cubbin's opposition to the decision to destroy Chinatown and his resignation immediately thereafter, the characterization doesn't jive. The fire was believed to be the only way to eradicate leprosy germs. Historically, heat has been used to purify. Heat makes clean. Hence why we boil water and use heat to sterilize surgical instruments. Humans typically burn what disgusts us, which really makes me wonder why the KKK burns crosses. In the hours following the meeting of 25 May 1906, an effort was made to keep the plans to burn Chinatown a secret. Like anything else in this city, those plans inevitably failed, and a crowd gathered to see the show. 1906 was a time where human beings still had control of their attention spans, and there weren't companies competing for it like there are today. A crowd of what some say was 1,000 gathered to see the blaze. A fire has always been a big draw, and it still is. Remember when Lighter Than Air Hangar No. 1 burnt down recently? Contemporary interpretations of this event depict it as a gleeful community gathering where the townspeople celebrated the destruction of property in a racial jubilation. Honestly, that's just sensationalized spin in order to cook a story and sell papers. The city fire marshal directed the Chinese to leave all their bedding and clothing in the buildings to be destroyed. Livestock and pets thought to be potentially infected were also summarily killed. It took over an hour for the fire to finally touch off before the wooden structures were completely engulfed. Chinatown was a pile of ash in short order. That was the evening of 25 May 1906. All without any violence towards any of the Chinese residents. No lynchings, beatings, or ponytail parties were reported. One would be hard-pressed to find another incident like this, shameful as it is, that didn't have an element of outright violence against the Chinese. When compared with the long list of reprehensible incidents in California that involved violent prejudice against the Chinese population, like the Chinese massacre in Los Angeles in 1871 and the pogrom of the San Francisco riot in 1877. Incidents of racial violence against the Chinese shamefully litter the legacy of the American West. This fact we recognize as generally and objectively true. In the aftermath of the burning, Mrs. Nellie Purington Tedford remembered this in the Santa Ana Register in December of 1928. The Chinamen were given houses out on the Santa Ana River and furnished with bedding, stoves, and all the necessary equipment that they had lost in the fire. a list of things had been made by the marshal. That was the end. Almost. The Imperial Chinese Minister and Ambassador to the United States, Mr. Cheng Tang Cheng Leng, appointed two Chinese men of prominence in Los Angeles, a Willie Chang Wing and an H. Lee, to investigate the burning of Chinatown. Mr. Lee conceded that the shacks were unfit for human habitation, and he further revealed that the Chinese consul of Los Angeles made repeated efforts to influence Mrs. Schaefer to make improvements and repairs. Mrs. Schaefer ignored these admonishments. We all know an absentee landlord, and it appears that Mrs. Schaefer was one. On 28 May 1906, the LA Times reported that the spirit of her dead husband objected to her making any changes. Quite the opposite of Mrs. Winchester of the Winchester Mystery House. And what did happen to Mr. Wong? Well, he was placed under the guard of a county employee, a man named Clinton Imes, and doctors would deliver food, milk, and topical medicine to Mr. Wong's tent, with Dr. Burlew and others looking in on him at regular intervals. Reports state that Mr. Imes was not of the best character and could not be relied upon to be at his post. On 6 June, a Dr. Williams was sent to Santa Ana by Mr. Lee to examine Mr. Wong. After a brief meeting at City Hall and at Dr. Ball's office, Dr. Williams was accompanied to Mr. Wong's tent by Drs. Jesse M. Burlew and Dr. Charles Dexter Ball. They found Mr. Wong deceased in his tent. Dr. Williams examined Mr. Wong's body and left within the space of 1 hour. Later that day, a team of 5 local physicians performed an autopsy at Smith's Undertaking Parlor at 106 West 4th Street, and this team of physicians confirmed leprosy. Dr. Burlew reportedly took bacterial cultures from Mr. Wong while he was still alive, and used these with 1906 microscopy to confirm the presence of the bacteria. These facts were recorded in the California Chinese mortuary record and his county death certificate. Mr. Wong was reportedly buried in the county's Potter's Field, which I wish I could locate. His official cause of death was listed as having had pneumonia for 4 days contributed by leprosy. This is commonly what happens when the bacteria reaches the internal mucosal membranes of the respiratory tract. The Board of Health of Santa Ana reported that they had sent their findings to the Southern California Medical Association for a full investigation. Through the guidance of another historian, I ventured to the archives of the Huntington Library, which houses the collection of the Southern California Medical Association. Box 48 of that collection held programs and other information about local doctors in Southern California. I saw that in the year 1906, Dr. Ball gave a presentation on public health and its officers. Coincidence? Maybe. I don't have his speech, so I can't tell you what was said, sadly. Dr. Williams would later allegedly recant his agreement to the diagnosis in the Los Angeles Examiner on 8 June of 1906, causing much drama and talk of professional censure. In the days following the fire, Mr. Lee questioned the validity of the leprosy diagnosis. He asserted that the Santa Ana Board of Health acted without warrant and later threatened suit. He did his best to advocate for these men under quarantine and sought what he felt was proper compensation. All good things, even commendable in the light of due process. An accounting was made of the material goods and merchandise lost in the fire to the amount of about $1,500. The Board of Health offered the paltry sum of $100 to a Mr. Yik Singh, who was seen as the representative of the entire group of quarantined men, with $70 of it being divided equally among the other 6. $100 in 1906 was roughly $3,400 today. This compensation was rejected. Interestingly, the Bowers Museum has one receipt of property burned on May 25, 1906, with 7 entries for reimbursement for damages ranging from $5 to $35. This receipt was not located in their collection within the production time of this video, but its existence and a record of its existence has been confirmed by the Bowers Museum's registrar. What about the widow Schaefer? She wrote a letter and sent it to the Board of Trustees in May of 1907, a year after the fire. This was reproduced in its entirety in the Register.
On May 24, 1906, upon the recommendation of the Board of Health of this city, your predecessors as trustees adopted and passed a resolution directing the destruction by fire of the buildings known as Chinatown, situated upon the northeast corner of the block upon which stands the City Hall, and the same were burned as directed by the trustees upon the same date. Up to this time, no compensation nor offer of compensation, therefore, has been made me, and I hereby file a claim against the city of Santa Ana, therefore. At the time said buildings were destroyed, I was in receipt of an annual income of $135 in rental. This amount paid me 8% interest on $1,675 per annum. Therefore, I sustained a direct loss of $1,675 from the destruction of said buildings, no matter what their value may have otherwise been in excess of this amount. These buildings covered an area of about 75 by 100 feet, and had they remained would soon have been in the course of extensive improvements, as C.W. Burns, my agent therefore, was in conference with the old board in reference to repairs and contemplated improvements. Now, if the city will settle this matter without putting me to any further trouble or annoyance, or the complications and expense of the courts in the collection of the damages, I will accept as compensation for the destruction of said buildings and the loss therein sustained the sum of $1,200. Respectfully submitted, Martha M. Schaefer.
Her admonishment was ignored by Mayor Arthur J. McFadden and other trustees. Arthur J. McFadden, an eyewitness to the burning, called the incident a premeditated act of malicious violence when interviewed in 1970 by Stephen Gould. Did he feel that way in 1906? Who is to say? But his disregard for Mrs. Schaefer and her demand following the fire should be noted. So now we are up to date, kind of. In May of 2022, the elected City Council passed Resolution 2022-39. The resolution had been drafted by Planning Commissioner Alan Wu. I had no part in this other than providing background research and a copy of the book to him, as well as Councilmember Hernandez and Councilmember Fan. Sadly, I was rehabilitating from an auto accident on 1 April where I was left severely injured. This resolution effectively recognized the burning of Santa Ana's Chinatown and formally apologized to the Chinese American community. Superficially, that's fantastic. All good things, long, long overdue. I was genuinely happy about this because something was finally being done, as performative as it is. Except it wasn't. On 20 May, I received an email invitation for the ceremonial signing of that resolution. The city actually woefully used verbiage from the resolution in the invite. The story outlined in the resolution is an utter contrivance of the facts, except for the direct naming of the historically involved governmental individuals and the fire's date. This resolution, rather disrespectfully, makes no mention of the late Mr. Wang and the 58-year-old Chinese man who was afflicted and died 10 days later of complications of pneumonia and leprosy. It does not mention the due process and due diligence actions taken by the Board of Trustees and the Board of Health over several days during this incident. It makes no mention of the city's decision to compensate or efforts to rehouse the victims of this fire. Almost like those details weren't convenient to mention in the first place. Whomever was supposed to fact check and vet this resolution should question their ability to do their job. The sin of omission is very present throughout this resolution. What that resolution does mention, though, is a particular motivation. Whereas the city made plans to remove Chinese residents and merchants in Santa Ana's Chinatown as part of an urban renewal effort to gain control of those properties for the building of a new city hall. Categorically, none of that narrative is correct. As you just learned, the city of Santa Ana purchased the lot in 1903 for $850. This lot was directly adjacent to Chinatown. That new city hall was occupied nearly 2 years, over 500 days prior to the fire. Why would they need land for an existing building? It sounds like a really lazy excuse to create motive. A lame duck attempt at a smoking gun. If you're going to lie, don't lay the crux of your argument on details that are so basic, like when the first dedicated city hall was built, when postcards of it are available on eBay. There are postcards that we can date to before and after the fire, where we can see buildings behind City Hall and then a vacant lot. In this photo scan from Bowers Museum, this is the only known photo of the fire, by the way. Notice the 2-story building in the upper left of the photo. That is the backside of the City Hall. the same they were burning Chinatown to build. Secondly, the city never took ownership of the properties where Chinatown was located. They didn't want it. That was never a conversation, which to me is actually kind of surprising. That land continued to be owned by Mrs. Schaefer, who eventually leased the properties to Andrew and Laura Roberts, who built Temple Theater on the site in 1909. Mrs. Schaefer continued to own the property until her death in 1917, and that land would remain a theater until the early 1960s, when that building was demolished and left as a parking lot that exists today. And finally, to say that the city made plans to remove Chinese residents and merchants in Santa Ana's Chinatown intentionally smacks of a conspiracy and is a totally baseless supposition. Images of old white men in business suits greedily rubbing their hands together comes to mind. The historical record doesn't support that whatsoever. I would argue that Chinatown could have continued despite the complaints from the citizens, in which there were several. They would have been soundly ignored. This sad attempt at cravenly pointing a finger at the created violence inherent in the system really lessens the impact of actual violence inherent in the system. I immediately attempted to get Commissioner Wu, who was like 70-something by the way, to fix the errors in the resolution, but was met with this: emails blaming city staff, taking no accountability, talking about how the facts don't matter, and that he doesn't want me speaking because, well, to use his own words, this apology is not to say that it was not urban renewal and that no one was hurt, and they, the city, tried to compensate the victims. He further goes on to say in his email, I just wanted you to know why I don't want him, Dylan, speaking, so that we can focus on the signing by Vince and the speeches from you, and I can assume he is addressing Councilman Jonathan Ryan Hernandez, Ty, who is Councilwoman Fan, and myself. It takes away from the story of resilience. Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. I wouldn't call creating false narrative as a way to stand on a pillar of resilience, but that's just me. Those items he lists in his email as what the apology is not to say are actually all true, and he knew it. He addresses them. He snitched on himself. And this guy is an appointed city commissioner, a person of some responsibility. He can't say, oh, I didn't know. Commissioner Wu went out of his way to block me from speaking that day and sharing the truth. I spoke to Wu before the event face to face. He avoided two things, an explanation and eye contact. Councilman Hernandez, in his kindness, offered to let me speak at the event. I wanted no part of it. This was embarrassing enough. Several local journalists had reached out to me days prior to the event, and I spoke to them. Councilman Hernandez later told me that he had spoken and corrected Wu on his behavior, and I am very sure he gave his axe-grinding mentor a very firm slap on the wrist. Did I mention that Wu had proudly organized for educators to come to this event and that these lies would be taught to children? For all the malice laced into this event, this incident has a semblance of a conscience. Think about that. The city didn't act immediately. Not all the trustees agreed on the best course of action, and care was actually given to the afflicted and the unhoused and the dispossessed. When I first started this research back in 2018, I asked myself, why do this? Why deliberate for 2 days? Why confer with multiple doctors like John Ingram Clark, Charles Extra Ball, Jesse M. Burlew, F. M. Bruner, H. S. Gordon? Why would the county board of supervisors try to find a nurse or some kind of specialist to help Mr. Wong if the case wasn't legitimate? Why go through the charade? Something tells me that it was legitimate and that they didn't know how to cure it, which, that microcosm of near hysteria, is something I think we are all too familiar with from the all too recent past of the last 3 years, that most of us would much rather forget. Also, imagine this. Santa Ana in those days was the religious epicenter of the county. It wasn't known as a church city for nothing. Hell, the original portion of Civic Center Drive used to be named Church Street. So here it was, the disease of the Bible, on the doorstep, quite literally, of the God-fearing city government, who, we can all be sure, read the Bible, because it was also how most folks learned how to read back then. This was the nightmare fuel of 1906. To quote the title of erstwhile OC Weekly writer Gustavo Arellano's inflammatory, putting it lightly, 2014 article on this subject, Santa Anna deliberately burnt down its Chinatown in 1906 and let a man die to do it. It is lazily convenient to assume that the late Mr. Wong was a scapegoat, and the city government leveraged the last days of his life to destroy his place of business, his home, and the homes of 200 other Chinese men living in Santa Ana's Chinatown. It is apparent that the trustees of the city of Santa Ana acted shamefully in May of 1906. They didn't know what they didn't know, simply because the information didn't exist. It was also 1906. The Chinese Exclusion Act had been in full effect since 1882. A treatment for leprosy wasn't developed until 1943. As inconvenient as it is, there are no real excuses for it. It is what it is. Unfortunate and tragic. Just the same way that Mr. Wong's life was used again 116 years later to serve the needs of another agenda that didn't even bother to mention his name, even though this time it was one of his own countrymen that leveraged his suffering. It could appear, superficially, that Mr. Wong was used as a sacrificial lamb not once, but twice. The second time in the name of spectacle. Did I mention there was a lion dance? A disservice was done in this city when that resolution was passed in 2022, just as in 1906. Prejudice repeats itself. A legitimate opportunity to educate, heal, and grow was lost when our elected officials, with the help of a very ill-appointed planning commissioner, acted selfishly and approved of an anti-truth that perpetuated a false narrative that egregiously created a villain out of the very city that they represent. Damage was done in the name of self-righteousness and clout-chasing. In this era of performative activism, this example is particularly pernicious. It would be dishonest to call this simply vacuous or simply inaccurate in and of itself, because it's demonstrated that they knew better and had every opportunity to educate themselves. An easy contemporary comparison to this would be, well, just recently, the Canadian Parliament recognized a Ukrainian World War II veteran for his service for fighting the Russians in World War II. Wait, weren't the Russians allies with the Canadian? Wait, that means this guy collaborated with the Nazis and volunteered. Oh, he volunteered to commit atrocity. This former Nazi was celebrated with a standing ovation by the Canadian Parliament. That must have been real weird for him. This is what happens when dilettantes seek to make political points on the backs of people suffering. Except, in this case, Canada, more so its idealistically fascist politicians, were just being very dumb opportunists, seeking to create spectacle and get some political points. They didn't know, or even worse, they didn't care, that he was a Nazi. They just wanted to look good. Whereas Chairman Wu, as he refers to himself on social media, had the facts and chose, deliberately, not to use them. The worst kind of performative activism is based on a lie. I don't know exactly why it was necessary to lie in order to apologize. The actual history didn't need any extra spice. It was tragic enough. Since when has it been acceptable to lie in order to apologize? Simply and forthrightly apologize. The teachers, students, and local press, the citizens of Santa Ana, were all lied to, carelessly, for clout. I asked Councilman Hernandez why he allowed his appointed commissioner to enter these lies in the public record. His response was simple: because he's Chinese. I would call that a token response. I have an obligation to present facts on the past, regardless of if I like it or not. The internet lives forever, and I'm an idealistic nerdy millennial that wants to be proud of the city that my family has called home for almost 4 generations. That same city that I worked 3 years as de facto archivist and historian in its public library. Also, I should be dead. If you're on thin ice, you might as well dance. All I can say is this. This is why we need historians. This continued injustice results from public dialogue disintegration and history being treated trivially as a political football and self-glorifying trophy. Combine this with the silencing of others, and we have our world today. This is what happens when lies go untested, and I get it. Fact isn't catchy, and it doesn't make for snappy copy that sells counterculture magazines. It isn't easy, but we all deserve access to the fuller picture to decide for ourselves, to be people who know how to think instead of what to think. If we as a people are going to recognize painful incidents of our past like this, and really, honestly, attempt to heal the trauma and make an honest attempt to teach the next generation to do better, and have a public discourse about these difficult things, at the very least, these conversations should be founded on evidence-backed fact and objective truth, regardless of how inconvenient they may be. Inconvenient truths are where the lessons are. And yeah, these conversations are uncomfortable. That's why it took me over a year to make this video. But the uncomfortable conversations are the ones we need most. Because I am a Santa Ana native and I want to be proud of my city, I want to end on a lighter note. Santa Ana is greater than the sum of its worst moments. For those that may not know, Santa Ana was the first city in Orange County to allow African Americans to own property and run businesses circa 1885, when all other cities in the county, particularly in the north, were notorious sundown towns, leading to Santa Ana being the epicenter of black culture in Orange County for nearly a century. And also, let's not forget that Santa Ana was the first city in Orange County to have an integrated school system circa 1914, apart from religious segregation between Protestants and Catholics. Was it perfect? Far from it. But there was that glimmer of hope. Not bad for a city founded by a bunch of Southerners from the Reconstruction-era South. Now, if you made it to the end, I appreciate you very, very much, and I thank you. These facts, need to be shared readily and openly. I made the decision to permanently demonetize this video. I want no money for sharing the truth. I just want the truth made available. A digital copy of Stephen Gould's book and a bibliography of all my sources and all the newspaper clippings I used in this video will be publicly available via link in the description, because that's where the truth is, in the research.